I think, I'm a biologist, so Chris and Karl don't know me. I'm a biologist, and my area of specialization is, broadly speaking, chemical ecology and toxinology.
Hmm.
And I'd like to get to that area, sort of my comfort zone, and maybe talk about things like the generation of novelty, things like generative noise, molecular babbling, exaptation, improvisation, play, all of these things. That's kind of my comfort zone, and I'd like to get to talking about that sort of thing, in the context of the free energy principle and how the free energy principle really approaches the genesis of novelty. But I would like to do the slightly more risky thing, at least for me, especially given my current state, and begin with physics and indeed even metaphysics. Um, so I'd like to sort of motivate an argument um, toward in support of a realistic and I've been using the term constructive realism in some of the discussions with Mike, a realistic interpretation of the free energy principle. And I think this is, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. It feels like there is a sort of controversy surrounding this. Um, and the concern that the FEP might have some anti-realist leanings. And there are also warnings, of course, Mel Andrews' fantastic paper, "The Math is Not the Territory." There are worries about a certain literalism that might come along with a realistic framing of the FEP. So I want to kind of look at how we can avoid that kind of literalism, but also not slide into anti-realism and not be sort of giving an account of, say, and I mean, I'll use this term under advisement, referencing both Anil Seth, but also, I suppose, you, Karl, not giving an account where we say things like perception is 100% hallucinatory or something like that. And maybe we can be illusionists. Of a kind, and we can preserve the fact that we're subject to delusion. There is a hallucinatory aspect to perception, but still couch that in a kind of realistic framework. And so I'd like to kind of get there by talking about kind of coarse graining as a fundamental physical principle, and really looking at the FEP itself as a description, as a formal framework which describes coarse graining. And I think one of the probably the fundamental challenges that a lot of people have with the FEP and the FEP literature is that there are, I mean, it's not just math heavy, right? It's got all of these different analogical formalisms in a certain sense. They kind of seem to come from different areas of physics, um, but be describing essentially the same kind of process. So the process is perhaps quite simple in its essence, but there are lots of different ways of cashing it out formally. I mean, maybe I'll stop waffling. Does that sound like a reasonable thing to say?
From my perspective, yes. I mean, you've touched on 101 issues there. Um, so so this is yeah. I think there's definitely two separate conversations. The philosophical interpretation of the free energy principle, or more specifically, the application of that kind of principle in different domains, and then um, the intriguing problem of novelty and play and exploration and model building and exploring various structures. Um, so I think the first issue, I mean, you very nicely scaffolded the issues. I think most of them, some from a physics perspective, could be fairly easily resolved, if not dissolved. Um, Having said that, you're going to have to be very careful in explaining terms that are not familiar to me. I have no foundational training in philosophy, so a lot of these distinctions I find entertaining, but very often I regard this as a spectator sport. It doesn't so much affect the application of the free energy principle. So my normal line in this kind of conversation would be the free energy principle is just a principle read as a physics principle. That means it's a method. So all you do is apply it. You don't argue about it. or you can, but it's there to be used. It's not there to be the target of philosophy papers. Um, how might you apply it? Well, you can apply it in many different ways, and the the utility of having that principle at hand is that now you can effectively reproduce or simulate sentient kind of self-organization, or at least, well, first of all, it equips you with an interpretation that has a teleology in terms of perception and sentience and play and novelty, if you want to go that far. But this is just a license to put a teleology on it in and of itself. The energy principle doesn't appeal to any teleology. It's much more tautological than that. It's a description of things that self-organize. Um, but it's in that deflationary aspect, though, it's important to remember that there is a very practical utility in the free energy principle because although it describes things that self-organize to some attracting set in the classical formulation of pullback attractor, um, what you can do when you know the dynamics that underwrite that self-organization is you can write down that attracting set in a computer, which means, or in any artifact in some kind of mortal computation, and then you just specify the dynamics, or you write in the dynamics by applying the free energy principle in terms of gradient flows or fixed point iterations, however you want to do it, which means you can build self-organizing systems where you specify the kind of system in terms of the attracting set that you want to reproduce and model. And once you've done that, you can then take that in two directions. You can then either put your teleology on it, so you can wax lyrical about this bacterium's playing, exploring, and you're fully licensed to sort of tell the basal cognition story, which is just a way, from my perspective, of equipping people with intuitions that of a teleological sort, which are not part of the physics, but they're certainly extremely helpful, I think, and allow you to join the dots between different fields and disciplines. Um, on the one hand, or you can actually use the effectively the digital twins or the simulation of the system you're interested in as an observation model for some empirical data. So that means that you can take an actual system um, or a system, the measurements of some system of interest, and then optimize the parameters of effectively your attracting set or your generative model until your simulated system now reproduces what you're observing empirically. And that will be one way of, if you like, reverse engineering the generative model that provides the best account of this particular system. And that is a fairly standard procedure in the cognitive neurosciences, particularly in computational psychiatry. That I get an addict or somebody who's very depressed responding to a well-defined experimental universe or paradigm, and then I model the choices of which could be novelty seeking, for example, formally defined under the free energy principle. I model the responses under the assumption that this subject is behaving and making decisions under this generative model with these priors. And then I optimize the priors until it reproduces the observed behavior. And that now allows me to phenotype the teleology, if you like, of this decision making formally. By using fairly straightforward procedures. I don't think it's ever been done, but in principle, you could do exactly the same thing for a cell or an organ or something along those lines. So that would be a sort of practical response to the map and the territory. I'm not sure. So literalism. Can you explain to me what that means? That means that people think that cells are actually perceiving. Is that the
I suppose literalism in the broader context, as opposed to where the cells are actually perceiving, would be, I mean, maybe another Korzybski aphorism gets at it nicely. So Alfred Korzybski is the one who said the map is not the territory. He also said, whatever I say a thing is, it is not. Literalism is basically taking a representation or a description of something to be the thing itself, essentially, like to map onto it one to one. So to say that the model is in fact describing exactly the dynamics or whatever of the system that is being modeled, perhaps.
Right.
Mm.
Well, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but that is certainly not the case for the free energy principle, in the following sense that from in elaborating or deriving the dynamics of any given system, you are um, and interpreting that in terms of a variational free energy that plays the role of a bound on the actual probability of occupying certain states, um, described in terms of the self-information or if you're a Lagrangian or adaptive fitness, if you wanted to. Um, so that variational bound is assumed to be infinitely tight um, under the free energy principle. So when there is a departure or a difference between the the actual dynamics of the system and its attracting set, and the way that you would write down or describe that attracting set in terms of a probability distribution, which is, you can read it many different ways. It can be this, surprise on the self-information, um, the negative log preference of the states, negative, a potential based upon states that are valuable to that system, that characterize that system. Then you have to assume that the um, the free energy is equal to the self-information, and then everything else follows. But if but because the free energy is a bound, then your description of the system, that is just basically evolving to its attracting set, minimizing its thermodynamic free energy. Um, in terms of minimizing a variational free energy, now only becomes a bound approximation. So you can't say that it's doing inference explicitly, because to do inference, there would have to be a gap between the variational free energy and the self-information. Um, However, if you assume that gap is small, you can now say it looks as if this system is making inferences. It looks as if it is self-evidencing. It looks as if it is trying to minimize its variation free energy, or it looks as if it is trying to maximize its marginal likelihood. Um, you can make a move in which you just say stipulatively the generative model of this system is actually its um, a probabilistic description of an attracting set, and then that teleology becomes exact, but you'll never know what that particular generative model is. So it's a nice philosophical move, but it doesn't help you practically, because the whole point of applying the free energy principle is to reverse engineer the underlying generative model, and thereby equip you with the description, the ability to simulate, reproduce that kind of behavior, and understand it in terms of the priors implicit in that generative model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's all, very, very helpful. I think the point that I'm suggesting is that um, I definitely don't think it's up to you or necessarily anyone who's utilizing the free energy principle in a more or less instrumentalist manner to define an ontology that it corresponds with. But I think there is, I think, a popular discourse and a philosophical discourse, an academic discourse surrounding that ontology. And I think that's inevitable, and especially given that, you make yourself very available for public discussion as well. And in that framework, there's generally a desire to interpret these things in a slightly different manner, and in a potentially in a more realist manner. So to say, well, what does this actually refer to? But I think that even before we dive into, say, you know, words like metaphysics and ontology, and one of the reasons I wanted to return to the basic physics, actually, I wanted to kind of build the story up from dissipative structures. Um, and even, and I know, you know, Chris and well, all of you have published on this quantum dissipative adaptation, but the kind of story that someone like Jeremy England is telling, I'm also relating that to the principle of least action and interpreting these things as constructive. So one of the questions that arises when arises for me as an evolutionary biologist, and I think would arise for Mike as a developmental biologist, when you're discussing the free energy principle in precisely the terms that you were just discussing it, and talking about how, you know, once you have defined this and you can write down this attracting set, you can talk about the behavior of this entity in relation to this attracting set. We do want to know, where does the attracting set comes from in a certain sense, right? That is what evolutionary biology and really developmental biology are. That's what biology is all about, you know. So we do want to. So even before we are being strictly speaking, you know, philosophical with a capital P or making our living in philosophy departments, we're asking these sorts of explanatory questions. We're asking these sorts of why questions. And when we find a principle like the free energy principle, you know, a formal framework like the free energy principle, useful and applicable, apt in some way. So, you know, we can go back to saying the map is not the territory, sure, but there are good maps and bad maps, you know. So if the free energy principle is apt in some way, what is that saying about the kinds of dynamics that it is describing, and how can that potentially be plugged into an explanatory model? And you've published a number of papers, and I know Mike and Chris have as well, on the basic isomorphism between the free energy print, the basic logic of the free energy principle, and say the logic of natural selection. Um, and also, you've defined them both as principles of least action. And I think we should note, right, that the natural selection is taken to be an explanatory principle. Um, and the principle of least action is essentially an ecological principle, right? It's about how the environment determines the principle, the path of least action. Um, and so I think I'm just suggesting that if we take the kind of constructive logic that we find in evolutionary biology, this attempt to explain the forms or explain the attracting sets, and we're making attracting sets equivalent to paths of least action, essentially, right? I think in the FEP, in the sort of path dependent way of thinking about the FEP, those are equivalent. Um, we do want to ask this basic evolutionary and ecological question, which is not confined just to biology now. We're thinking about, you know, generative constructive process in evolutionary terms, and we're thinking about a relational landscape in terms of ecology. So generalizing those notions, and we're asking how the free energy principle, I suppose, which appears to describe those things perfectly, appears to be, you know, a beautiful way of describing those things. You know, how that aligns with our aspirations for having explanatory, for gaining explanatory knowledge through frameworks like this, and how. I think, you know, I've heard you be asked the question a number of times and comment on the question a number of times. You know, something like, you know, why do you speak about latent or hidden variables as opposed to just appearances? This is another way people try to draw you into philosophical conversations about realism, I know. Um, and this is essentially the same kind of question, because we're talking about what is the actual environment, the real environment that is then defining the attracting set, defining the landscape, and its energy minima, and therefore its paths of least action. And so I suppose all I'm getting at here is that the FEP does seem ripe for, and again, I'm not suggesting that it's your task to provide that, but does seem ripe for a kind of realist ontology that fits with this basically ecological and evolutionary framing of it.
Yes, well, I agree entirely. Um, So I'm going to stop talking now because I'm sure Chris and Mike have lots of things to say. But yeah, that relational aspect, and I think the phrase that comes to mind is the scale invariant aspect of applying the FEP, and that's I'm sure Chris will have something to say about this. So the phenotyping context. What is the context? Well, the context itself in a scale free or in the spirit of the renormalization group should also be um, amenable to application of the free energy principle, and that basically induces now the kind of, say, George Ellis like top down and bottom up causation. And to me, that's the most important relational aspect. I mean, there are lots of really important relational aspects in terms of ensemble self-organization, between cells at any particular space-time scale. But I think the deeper question you're speaking to is much more of a scaling issue. Again, looked at from the point of view of the renormalization group, and it's how does the free energy minimizing process, which could be natural selection or Bayesian model selection, if you like. How does that contextualize the play of a phenotype with its conspecifics or exploring its environment, and how does the environment perceive the perceive in a literalist sense, perceive the phenotypes that are co-constructing that environment. So I think that those issues, are, if you like, that those issues, or perhaps the frame afforded by a scale invariant, if not in scale free application of the free energy principle, is probably the frame in which you would start to address these deeper questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like to think of it in terms of coarse graining, because and thinking of coarse graining as a constructive process that actually can occur endogenously. Like if we look at dissipative structures and things like that, it's a sort of it's self-organization in the sense that the environment ends up coarse graining itself in a certain way. So I say endogenous coarse graining, and that gives us an image of how you get a hierarchical structure in a certain sense, right? These nested coarse graining, and that can take us all the way to Mike's polycomputing and collaborative coarse graining in multicellular organisms and all sorts of fascinating stuff there. And I'm going to shut up as well, but the other thing is just to say that if the FEP is completely general and fundamental principle, like a principle of least action, then the environment, of course, we're not only speaking of the environment and its relationship to a particular individual agent that's navigating and finding energy minima and things like that. We're thinking of the way the environment itself is constructed, right? So the environment is constructed in exactly the same way as the organism, and that's why, to get to the origin of novelty thing and drawing a long bow, the landscape is constantly shifting, right? So it shouldn't be thought of, just as natural selection shouldn't be thought of as really an optimality model. It's a local optimality model, but there's no global optimum. The fitness landscape is changing all the time, just as the energy landscape is changing all the time. And that's precisely because every component of the landscape is, continually trying to find, but also constructing, and that's the active principle and active inference, right? Its own path of least or stationary action. So yeah, I'll be quiet now.
I'll just toss in a couple of comments to what Karl said that I think was very wise, of course. Um, I think the FEP, looking at sort of the philosophical literature around it, is deeply at risk of becoming like quantum theory
Mm.
and spawning an entire discipline of interpretation that goes on for decades and achieves nothing. And I, as you point out, that may just be inevitable. But if one sticks very close to the physics, then what, for example, you referred to as literalism when you were defining it generally, is actually forbidden by the physics. I mean, the physics tells us we cannot construct such models in principle. So uh, that issue, in a sense, is entirely made up uh, and is based on the assumption of a kind of epistemic perspective that dates from the early part of the 19th century. And at least since quantum theory is no longer valid, no longer worth considering. And
I
I
think
like this idea of sticking extremely close to the physics because the physics itself, as you were describing at the very end, has a lot to tell us about this generation of complexity. And you know, we have this very common point of view that um, things start out simple and they get more complicated, and it's not at all clear that that's correct. Uh, Things are sort of potentially complicated all the time, and it's a bit of a matter of who's looking and how are they looking to be able to tell just how complicated they are at some particular scale where we're choosing to do some modeling. So I guess I would recommend against trying to get too deep into a philosophical discussion that's motivated by concepts that are actually inconsistent with the physics that's being used to formulate the principle. And one has to get deep into it to see where the inconsistencies are, but that's possible.
I think that that's very good advice, and I fully agree. And actually, I think that it's not only, in a sense, the physics that tells us that such a model is impossible. I think what I was saying about there not being any global optimum. That's an evolutionary principle, and there's a whole branch of epistemology called fallibilism, which is evolutionary epistemology of people like Charles Sanders Peirce and latterly Karl Popper, which really fits with that idea. It's specifically directed against the fallacy of literalism, of imagining that we could ever have a final, perfect map, so to speak. Again, partly because the territory itself is continually changing. But there are, and I also fully agree with you what you were saying about quantum theory and this profusion of literature on interpretations that maybe doesn't get us anywhere. But I do think, and this is partly just my temperament, that there are ways to do philosophy well, and there are ways to do it poorly. And there are also some great process relational thinkers who in many cases are themselves deeply grounded in mathematics and logic, like Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Sanders Peirce, who come up with systems, very elaborate systems, but that are in many ways strikingly similar to the free energy principle. Also reducible on some level. And I mean, Peirce in particular is extremely explicit about this, that all of logic, according to Peirce, is reducible to his, basic categories of firstness, secondness, and thirdness, right? So, and he takes it to be the task of metaphysics to reduce, to divine or derive the most basic set of categories from essentially which all of reality can be derived in some sense, right? Which might sound preposterous on one level, but it's a kind of, min-maxing exercise in human thought, right? The minimal fundamental postulate for the maximal diversity that can be generated from it. And it's very striking that, Peirce's categories, which when translated into his evolutionary cosmology are firstness is tachism or chance. Secondness is anarchism or evolution according to a law. And thirdness is agapism, evolution in relation to some kind of goal. And these can also be mapped onto, and actually Peirce explicitly does this well before Richard Lewontin, but Lewontin quite famously reduced natural selection to a set of like a triad of principles, right? Variation, heredity, and selection. And Peirce has essentially that exact same logic, and he looks to derive the entirety of logic, but also, of course, a metaphysical scheme from that. And so I do think these things can be done better or worse, essentially. You know, there are principles there. And I do think there is, I mean, I kind of think there's a need for it to be done well. I agree that it's going to be inevitably done poorly, but I almost feel, I almost feel like that, I'll quote Peirce again, the only antidote to poor opinions is more opinions in some sense, right? If you think about the community of inquirers, there's going to be a lot of noise out there. And I'd love us to get to generative noise and get back to the, ooey gooey biological realities. But I do think that there's a need for and I think people who, of course, have a very, very deep familiarity with the physics, who understand what it is to be very close to the physics, exactly as you guys are describing, well, one needs to have that familiarity with the physics to be able to do the philosophy well, kind of, somewhat self-evidently. And perhaps the reason a lot of the philosophy will be done poorly is because of a lack of that familiarity. But I suppose that all I'm suggesting here is that's why there is a need for people, perhaps such as yourselves, but perhaps not, who have that deep familiarity to engage in those spaces, rather than saying that that's just a waste of time, because which I'm not attributing to you entirely, but one of the questions that does come up again is this question of sort of something like solipsism or whatever, and this has been around certainly in philosophy for a very, very long time, and a certain misreading of Immanuel Kant, which comes up a lot in philosophical discussions of the FEP, as a kind of anti-realist and potentially a solipsistic philosopher. But solipsism and this kind of anti-realism where, we can't say anything about what's behind the appearances or behind the blanket, so we may as well say there's nothing behind it. It does have both, it has unethical consequences, which are important, but maybe we don't need to go into them. But it's also just profoundly boring, because it, again, going back to the need for explanatory hypotheses, it makes it impossible to actually explain anything. And that's, I think, why, those are some of the things that I think motivate a kind of constructive realist reading of the FEP, which again is going to be a philosophical gloss for sure. It's going to deviate, it's going to be an interpretation of the physics. But I think that I do think that there is a need for those sorts of things. I'd love to hear Mike weigh in on that.
Well, I'll be pretty brief, because I want you guys to get to the generative noise discussion. But well, two things that stand out to me in what you guys have said. First, this question that was touched on briefly: where does it come from? Where do things come from? And I've been thinking about this a lot, because I get asked this all the time. Like when I talk about bioelectric patterns, well, where do they come from? And to me, what's very interesting is kind of the philosophical status of that question, because it seems to me that it's one of those questions that no answer to that question is ever satisfying. That is, no matter what you say to that question, it never feels like you've answered the question. People say, well, yeah, okay, but where does that come from? And of course, that any 5-year-old will sort of take it in an infinite direction. And so, to me, it's what I spend a lot of time thinking about is what is a constructive answer to that question, that at least, okay, we can always sort of go further at some point, but when have you really said something, as opposed to saying nothing, knowing that you're never going to say everything? And it often, in my case, you end up with, okay, so there's some genetics that set the parameters of the hardware, so let's say the ion channel properties and things like that, and then there's some environmental things that are going on, and then there's and so selection, but then also there are these sort of laws of mathematics, laws of computation that are neither of the previous things. You don't have to evolve them, and they're not contingent features of the environment. They're just sort of there, but they have massive implications for what patterns you do or do not get. And so you sort of name these three and you say, okay, well, it's kind of a function of those three. And that seems to be no one finds that satisfying for some reason. And so that's what I spend a lot of time thinking about, is like, what kind of what are, I mean, functionally, scientifically, that actually works quite well, because knowing those things, you can then do all kinds of experiments and you can find new things. And I think a lot of the things we build are actually exploring this Platonic space outside of directed evolution, and whatever the genetic hardware is doing. Like, what other attractors are there in the space that we get into xenobots and anthrobots and these things that have never been here on Earth before, and yet they have specific behaviors and specific forms and so on. But that's just, philosophically, that's what's interesting to me, is like, can we do some good work around helping people decide what kinds of answers are useful answers? What are they really looking for when they ask that, given that they're not going to be satisfied with the questions that do lead science forward? So what else are they looking for, right? That's one thing that I often spend time on. And then the other thing is what you were just saying, and this distinction, or the distinction people want to make between, well, is it really, or does it just seem like it? And often, again, people say, well, you're saying these gene regulatory networks can remember, but that's just a metaphor. You don't really mean that, And I could be, no doubt, I'm philosophically naive, but I don't know what people really mean when they try to make that distinction. It seems to me that it's all metaphor. I don't get it. And I think a lot of my colleagues think that, well, we have real things like pathways. Pathways are real, and then there's this crazy metaphorical stuff like like memory and cells. And I don't know, pathways seem metaphorical to me. Like, it just seems like it's all metaphor, and I don't think we need to say that nothing exists behind it. But I think it seems inevitable that what we're doing here is building different maps that are going to facilitate certain kinds of things and obscure other kinds of things. And that seems fine. I don't think that leads us into terrible, dilemmas. But I don't know. Do you see what do you think about that?
Well, I think there's another long conversation to be had about the use of language. That could take us far afield, and we wouldn't get to generative noise. But yes, in a sense, language is every word is metaphorical. Words don't have intrinsic meanings, obviously, right? So we're going to rule out literalism from the get-go in language, just as we do in physics and in any kind of modeling endeavor. And we can think about language as a way of modeling the world and communicating our models of the world to one another, etc. But nonetheless, there are needs to draw boundaries in our usage of certain language. And there are, of course, these context-dependent meanings that are different in different discourses. So, there's a way that you use, a certain word in a certain context, and that context is defined by a culture, by some sociocultural network, maybe an academic network, but maybe a popular, et cetera, et cetera. We can go very deep on this kind of thing, and there may be reasons. We don't want to try and define what Alfred North Whitehead called it. We don't want to commit the fallacy of the perfect dictionary, right? This was his dismissal of so-called ordinary language philosophy, where people argue endlessly about meanings and exactly what should this word mean, right? That's of course a fallacy and a dead end. But at the same time, we all recognize that there are, words do have meanings. And yes, the words are polysemous, so they have different meanings in different contexts, but nonetheless, we all probably have some boundary that we would want to draw. And everyone's going to have a different intuition about that. And it may depend on your disciplinary background. If you're an academic in particular, where you're going to draw those lines might be quite dependent on your disciplinary background. But again, it doesn't mean that's not a conversation we should have. And if people have resistance to using the word, memory for a gene network or whatever it might be, then it's worth probing that resistance, not to find a final answer as to whether this is the appropriate term or not, but just to work out what's going on with that resistance and that usage of the word. So unless anyone wants to say anything about that, we should probably pivot to this discussion of the generation of novelty, which I just take, and again, this is just my temperament, and I'm an evolutionist, to be like amongst the most interesting of questions. I'm also, one of my other backgrounds, I have a music degree. I'm very interested in composition and improvisation and all of these sorts of things. And for me, my understanding of music, both, my practical understanding as an improvising player, but also my understanding of the evolutionary history of music, the cultural evolution of music, has a big impact on the way I think about biological systems. And that's, that's why something like the FEP, again, with its scale-free, nature, is very appealing. But so I think what I would just say, to sort of kick this off, we talked about, or I talked about a little bit, the landscape is constantly shifting. We took, because it is itself constructed of free energy minimizing or path of least action seeking entities of different kinds, and so this means that there's an inherent context specificity we know that there's that for fitness, right? Fitness is highly context specific. If I take an organism that's highly specialized for one environment and transplant it to another, it's it's what was adaptive can very readily become maladaptive, and we see that in catastrophes, as the catastrophists in evolutionary theory can tell us. But I think a basic model from evolutionary theory, and I am going to link this to Charles Sanders Peirce again, just to show that this metaphysical perspective is super relevant here, but is that there is a Peirce's firstness, Peirce's Tychism or chance. There's always a stochastic element, and an irreducible, in a certain sense, stochastic element that we see at all these different levels of organization, right? And in evolutionary contexts, we could speak of genetic drift and things like that. We can speak of lots of different mechanisms. We could speak of stochastic gene expression, as Chris once really memorably said, I think in a discussion with you three, he talked about babbling, and that's just stuck with me ever since. I've got a 2.5-year-old daughter, so I've been through all of that, literally in the last couple of years. But for sure, molecular babbling, this is what I study, actually. I study the genesis of novel functions in chemical ecology, and stochastic gene expression, as well as, of course, genetic mutation, are these chancy elements that are ineliminable. They are constitutive of the explanatory logic that we have in evolutionary biology, right? So that's the principle of variation, what generates variation. And you have these you have theorists like Brandon and McShay who speak of this as a so-called zero-force evolutionary law, right? So there's always something driving, in the sense that there's always change going on, and then there's selection obviously acting on that change. And I think, speaking of the evolution of complexity, you've got this constant input of novelty in these ways, and then you've got elements of the other elements of the environment complexifying, and then of course if we're speaking of you as a a lineage or whatever, any given entity or path through this landscape has to respond in kind, or may have to respond in kind, to the complexification of its environment, and then we get this driven evolution of complexity. Even though I take Chris's point that things can be complex, certainly from the get-go. Now, it'd be great to get into sort of exaptation and even things like, chemical ecology and the reorganization of phenotypes and things that, Mike and I have been discussing for a long time specifically. But I think it would just be really great to get a kind of FEP take on, we talked about how do we get this attracting set? What about how do we move from one attracting set to another, if that's a possible thing to talk about, So when you were talking about a certain deviation, Karl, earlier from the attractive set, so there are perturbations that are, deviating an organism from its attracting set, and it's undergoing, homeoretic return to that attracting set, homeostasis, allostasis, etc. But there's also this generative noise. There's also this deviation from a particular phenotype in a way. It could be a molecular phenotype. And of course, you talk about experience-dependent plasticity and all of these things, but there's this deviation from a particular attracting set, and eventually even the discovery of, the creation of, the construction of, if it's permissible to say it in that way, novel attracting sets. So how does the FEP want to speak of that sort of thing?
I think the sort of key theme here will be a separation of temporal scales, time scales, in the sense that once one goes scale invariant, and I think one has to talk sensibly about this sort of, this relational aspect that is not just a horizontal one, but vertical in terms of, I live in a culture and that culture lives in the, and so on and so forth, and my cells in my brain live in me. Then the change in the Waddington landscape, which for me is just the free energy landscape, is simply a reflection of the fact that there are sufficient statistics or parameters that control the shape of that landscape that themselves are pursuing a trajectory on another free energy landscape at a slower time scale. So that practically licenses what could be construed as an adiabatic approximation. So if you just pick your particular scale of inquiry, you can then make the assumption that the parameters that shape your particular landscape, what it is to be a good phenotype in this particular eco niche for this generation, for example, you can assume that they are approximately not changing in time. So they're changing so slowly that for this phenotype, or perhaps during this critical period of development, or this day, the solutions to my dynamics that define the attracting set, the kind of states that I want to occupy, are fixed. They may change tomorrow, but for today, these are the solutions that best describe what is happening to me. So on that view, you're looking at changes, very slow changes, from the perspective of any scale you picked when looking upwards. When looking downwards, now the fast changes now become noise. So if one starts from the classical formulation and the path integral formulation of the free energy principle, one generally starts with a random dynamical system. For example, you could call it a Langevin equation if you're that kind of physicist. But in effect, it's just a statement that there is some lawful relationship between the dynamics and the state, plus some noise, the random fluctuations. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the difference between the random fluctuation and the fluctuations that are described by the motion of the states? So what licenses you to say, well, this particular kind of state is a random fluctuation, a noise process, whereas this kind of state is actually lives in a state space that can be, I can describe now in terms of, I would need to describe a random dynamical system. For me, the answer is just, again, separation of timescales. States that could change very, very quickly, the ones down there, are just noise. So what that leads to is a notion, well, again, can I know it's a little bit of a cop-out. I know that Richard Feynman didn't really like it, but I do find the notion of the renormalization group very useful here. And it really speaks to your focus earlier on coarse graining. So if you coarse grain in time, then you've now got a way of understanding how stuff down there at lower scales is averaged away by the coarse graining simply because you've treated it as noise. So the noise averages away. So you don't get those irrelevant variables. And I mean relevant versus irrelevant in the sense of the renormalization group. So when you move to the next scale up, be it a cell or be it a person, um, um, simply because you've got the RG operator has in it that coarse graining, that grouping and reduction operator that, if you like, throws away the noise at that level, but you now retain the itinerancy of the dynamics, and that now constitutes the time scale of it, and certainly the time constants of the dynamics at this scale. But of course, some of those dynamics will be very, very fast, and they will disappear when you move to the next time scale. So for me, the free energy principle, I think, gracefully accommodates um, the the essential it gracefully accommodates noise in the genesis of self-organization of a scale-free sort um, via exactly the coarse graining you were talking about before. And of course, once you now admit in both the sense of George Ellis, but also I subscribe to Herman Haken's synergetic notions of circular causality. So I'm speaking now not of a George Ellis-like approach, but much more the kind of approach you'd find in center manifold theorems, and specifically the enslaving principle in synergetics, where the context that's shaping the current landscape is now it is enslaving the microscopic dynamics at the level below, but the microscopic dynamics at the level below are being coarse-grained to provide the dynamics at the level above. So there's an inherent circular causality. So you can never say this causes that, or where did that come from? The answer is always both. It's always circular. It can be no other way. But in that inducing that sort of slaving principle or synergetics perspective, then I think you are really foregrounding the notion of these coarse graining operators and what they're applying to. They're being applied to suppress certain kinds of fast fluctuations and noise, to reveal slower ones, and so on, all the way up and all the way down. So that's how the free energy principle would accommodate this this kind of scale-free itinerancy. Where there is no ultimate attracting set, because for there be an attracting set, you have to pick out one scale, but that's not the story. The story has to be scale free, and as soon as you do that, then there's always a scale above that's changing your attracting set or your goal. I was intrigued by I read about Peirce. That's not true. People have told me I should read about Peirce, from the point of view of semiotics and like. But I never heard that three-way thing. But it does strike me, if you wanted to start with the classical path-integral formulation of the free energy principle, you'd need those three elements. You need one. You'd need the random fluctuations. That's omega. Two, you would need the systematic lawful relationship between the state and the flow. And three, you would need the existence of a pullback attractor before it's worthwhile talking about it. Otherwise, you get exponential divergence. There's nothing to talk about. So you need those three ingredients. You need to take a random dynamical system with a lawful relationship plus the chance, the noise, and then say there is a pullback attractor. And just to note, the pullback attractor is itself a random variable, so it is also inherently noisy. It is stochastic object. So there is no unique pullback attractor. The very fact it's a pullback attractor means you're dealing with itself, the attracting set is itself at any given scale a random variable, that has an infinite number of realizations. Does that help?
Oh yeah, very much. And I'm glad that you returned to Peirce there. I think he was really onto something with his triadic foundation for logic, and I think that can be, I think that can be mapped onto the free energy principle very, very elegantly, as well as onto evolutionary systems in general. And that's certainly what he was thinking. So that's beautifully described. And I think that the key thing to bring in, and I'd like to hear Chris, and there's not much time, but Chris and also Mike, if possible, say something. But this notion of exaptation in biology, in evolutionary biology, there's much to say about that. But in a way, it's a kind of a principle of multiple realizability as well. It's to say that, you know, what's irrelevant from a given reference frame can become relevant in a certain sense to a slightly different reference frame. So it's sort of like, how does noise get converted into signal? And so I think, yeah, how does the irrelevant become relevant in this sense? And I think you have addressed that to a degree, but I'd love, you know, Chris perhaps to jump in on that.
Well, I think that I would add one thing to Karl's basic story about coarse grading and the renormalization, and that is that one of the things that we are renormalizing here is what we call the system and what we consider the system of interest, and what we consider to be the system whose generative model we're describing. And uh, all systems that we know anything about as active inference agents, one of the kinds of action that they're capable of is to um, organize some of the degrees of freedom of their environment into a little package that they uh, don't control but associate closely with. So, I mean, you see this starting with quarks, right? uh, you see it in protons that are going to go out and find some degrees of freedom of the environment, what we would call an electron or a neutron or something like that, and grab that degree of freedom and exert some sort of control over it. And that's one of the basic things that active inference agents do. And what you get out of that is a system at a larger scale with a different generative model. So a deuterium nucleus looks very different from a proton, and a hydrogen atom looks very different from a proton. And if you're a proton, you can fork and do one or the other, or you can do both. And in all cases, what you're doing is decreasing your free energy. So the proton's much happier if it has an electron in association with it. It's much happier if it has a neutron in association with it from the point of view of its free energy. But by doing that manipulation of the environment to decrease its free energy, it's constructed, if you will, a new system that has its own model and its own Markov blanket and its own free energy definition. And then that system is going to do exactly the same thing. And Mike and I, years ago, wrote a paper about cell division as a way to decrease your free energy. If you're a cell, you just make a copy. But what does that really involve? It involves harvesting a whole bunch of the degrees of freedom of the environment and packaging them up in a particular way, sort of using yourself as a blueprint, and then turning them loose, but not very loose. And when you do that, you've suddenly decreased your free energy a lot, but you've also constructed something else that has a new generative model.